If you study civilian survival during World War II long enough, a hard truth emerges. Families who planned their food in January rarely went hungry by winter. This wasn't luck. It wasn't government aid. It was disciplined planting choices made when the ground was cold, seed catalogues were thin, and ration books were already shrinking. Wartime farmers understood that January was not a dead month. It was the month where calories were secured, storage was planned, and crops were chosen not for taste, but for survival value. What they planted then had to feed people 12 months later, when nothing else was coming. Today we garden for variety and convenience. During World War II, people planted for endurance. The crops selected in January were chosen because they stored well, produced heavily, tolerated poor soil, and could be replanted or preserved without electricity. These 13 crops weren't fashionable, but they kept families alive across Europe, Britain, and North America. If you understand why they were chosen and how they were used, you can still apply this knowledge right now, whether you're growing on a quarter-acre or a backyard plot. Potatoes were treated as insurance, not just food. Potatoes were the backbone of wartime survival because they delivered more calories per square foot than almost any other crop. Families started chitting seed potatoes indoors in January, setting them near windows to form strong sprouts before planting. This simple step added weeks of growth and increased yields dramatically. Potatoes stored in root cellars could last 8 to 10 months, and even sprouting potatoes were replanted for the next cycle. A modern grower can still do this by reserving part of the harvest strictly for replanting and storage, never eating the best seed stock first. Cabbage was grown because it solved 3 problems at once. Cabbage fed families fresh, fermented and stored. January planning focused on selecting late varieties meant for sauerkraut and cellar storage. Wartime households shredded and fermented cabbage because it preserved vitamins without fuel or refrigeration. One large crock could provide months of nutrition. Today, planting cabbage with the intention of fermenting it restores a lost skill that turns a single crop into long-term food security. Carrots were chosen for storage, not salads. The carrots grown during the Second World War, well, they weren't delicate or sweet varieties. Instead, they were thick, dense, and bred specifically for storage. Families would plan out their carrot beds as early as January, knowing they could store them buried in sand or soil right through the winter. This method, you see, required no electricity at all and kept carrots edible for months on end. Even today, modern growers can, replicate this by harvesting late and storing carrots unwashed in cool, dark conditions, rather than relying on refrigeration. Dry beans were essentially treated as wartime currency. Beans provided protein, served as seed stock, and acted as valuable trade goods. January planting plans back then focused on dry bean varieties, not green beans. These beans were allowed to mature fully, dried, and then stored away in sacks. Families would soak, sprout, and cook them throughout the year. Just a single row planted with dry beans could honestly feed a household protein right through the winter. Even today, growing dry beans offers a level of calorie density and independence that's pretty much unmatched by most garden crops. Beets were valued because, nothing was wasted. Beets were planted since both the roots and the greens could be eaten. January planning always emphasized multi-use crops, and beets fit that perfectly. The The roots could be stored or pickled, greens eaten fresh or cooked, and even the beet water was reused in soups. Modern gardeners can take a page from this, by selecting crops where every part serves a purpose, reducing waste and increasing total food output. Turnips and rutabagas filled the hunger gap. These crops were not popular, but they were dependable. Turnips and rutabagas grew in poor soil and cold conditions, making them ideal for uncertain seasons. Families planted them knowing they could harvest late and store them through winter. Today, they remain some of the most resilient calories you can grow in marginal conditions. Onions were planned in January because they required a long growing season. Once harvested and cured, they stored themselves without special conditions. Wartime cooks used onions to stretch meals, add flavour to simple dishes, and preserve morale. Modern growers still benefit from planting onions early and storing them dry, rather than relying on store-bought supply. Winter wheat was grown even in small plots. Some families planted small wheat plots or shared communal fields. Wheat provided bread, thickening for soups, and seed security. While most people today won't grow wheat, even small-scale grain experiments can restore understanding of how calorie independence once worked. Peas were planted for drying, not for fresh eating, Dried peas were really a staple protein and a thickener in many kitchens. January planning often involved selecting varieties meant to dry right there on the vine. These peas would be split, stored, and used throughout the year. Honestly, this practice can still be applied in home gardens today by just allowing peas to fully mature, instead of picking them young. Kale was chosen because, it simply refused to die. It survived frost, neglect, and even poor soil, which is quite impressive. Families really relied on kale as fresh winter greens when nothing else remained. Even now, kale can be harvested right through the snow, making it one of the most reliable foods for the cold season. Parsnips, interestingly, improved in flavour after a good frost and were often just left in the soil until needed. This acted as a sort of natural storage, you see. Modern gardeners can still use this method today, harvesting parsnips as needed rather than pulling them all up at once. So, squash was chosen for its shelf life, not for its size. Winter squash varieties were selected because of their thick skins and their ability to be stored for a long time. Once they were properly cured, they could last for months. Families relied on squash as a dependable winter calorie source, not just as a summer vegetable. Jerusalem artichokes, they were planted as a sort of famine insurance. These hardy tubers could survive neglect and would multiply underground, almost like magic. Even if fields were damaged, you'd find them coming back. Families counted on them as a last resort source of calories. And honestly, they're still one of the most resilient food crops you can find today. What really connects all these crops isn't just nostalgia, it's logic. They store well, they produce a lot, and they don't need much to grow. January planting was about discipline and foresight, not just blind optimism. If you use these same principles now, you're not just copying the past, you're actually reclaiming it. If this sort of, forgotten wartime knowledge matters to you, Make sure you subscribe, share this with someone who still believes in growing real food, and keep these lessons alive. History only helps us if we're willing to use it.